In this lesson, we'll be preparing the artboards. Okay, so let's get started here in your project files and 02_begin in your Illustrator folder. We're going to be using the typeface that was created in the Digital Tutors course, Creation and Integration of a Display Font in Illustrator. That's by our creative development author, Petros Afshar. And so these letters that he's created for us really lend itself to the type of animation that I want to create once we bring it into After Effects. So let's say you're in the same position, you've created a typeface and now you're ready to animate it. What's the first thing you need to do to get it into After Effects? Well, there's a way that we can work that's going to be really efficient for being able to place these letters later in After Effects, being able to animate each one individually, and being able to save ourselves some time for each of these little pieces here that are repetitive. So I'm going to be going through showing you all of those. And the first thing that you need to get started with is creating artboards for each letter. Now, to be able to quickly create an artboard for each letter, it's good to have each of the letters grouped. So you see, if I come in here and I try to select the letter, it's only selecting pieces of it. So I need to go through and draw a box around the letter to group it. Now, you'll see this started to move around, this background I have here. So let's go into our layers panel, and layer 2, where we have that dark background, I'm going to lock that. So everything we're dealing with is in layer 1. That's where all the type is. Okay, so we'll go ahead, draw a box around the letter A and hit Control G to group it. And now you can see I can select that letter and the whole thing moves together. That's very important. So I'm going to quickly go through and just draw a box around the letters, selecting them and hitting Control G to group those letters. And this is important because there's a really neat little trick that not a lot of people know about Illustrator that you can do with artboards and groups. So it's definitely going to speed up your workflow for creating the artboards for these letters, and it's also going to help us later on once we bring the artboards into After Effects as compositions. So that's going to come into play as well, and it's very important that you do it this way. Now, an interesting thing is going to come into play also when we start creating our artboards. It doesn't really matter what order I group these in. Like you can see I maybe did Q, R, S, T, and then went down to the W like this. Well, that's okay for my grouping, but when I go in to create my artboards, I need to be extremely careful that I stay in the order of the alphabet, because that is going to make a big difference later on in the course, and you'll see why in a few lessons. So to create our artboards, what we want to do is come over here and grab our artboard tool, and because we have our groups, I can just left click the letter, and it's going to create an artboard that is exactly the size of that letter. Pretty awesome. Now again, as I said, you want to make sure that you go in and you'll want to make sure that you're clicking them in order. So you don't want to jump down a line. Sometimes you might have to double click because it's going to be still selecting this artboard, so you'll need to kind of deselect and then click again. So you get to kind of see how that works. And I'm just using the space bar to toggle over to my hand tool, just holding the space bar while I pan down like that. And then I'm just left clicking to get an artboard in order for all of my letters. Okay. And just one more little toggle with the hand tool, hitting the space bar. And we'll finish up these artboards. So you should end up with 26 artboards. Actually, in our case, it looks like we have 27. So what's the reason for that? Well, you have to have at least one artboard in Illustrator. So we actually have an artboard up here at the top that was holding this big piece. We don't need that anymore. So we can just come up here and left click that artboard. And now you can see these reorder. So now this one is number 1 instead of 2. And this one is now 26. Perfect. Okay, so we've got all of our artboards now around all of our letters. And now we can go on to our next step, which is going to be ungrouping the letters. Now, why would you ungroup them when you just grouped them all together? Well, if we want to be able to have access to animating the individual pieces in After Effects, we want to have control over those pieces. Right now, it's just going to show up as one big piece in the letter. So I'm just going to select all the letters and hit Control-Shift-G. And now, even though I had to group them all individually to start off with, that actually goes in and ungroups them all for you. Now, you may want to go through and click and check and make sure that it got everything. Just, if you had any groups prior to that, you may have to release a couple of groups. We didn't in this course because I gave you the project file with no groups in it. But if you're animating your own typeface, you may want to watch out for additional groups that you may have missed. Okay, so we've gone through, we've grouped each letter, we made artboards for each letter, we ungrouped all of our letters, and now there's one more step that I want to take, which is grabbing the pieces that are repetitive. So if we look through here, we've got this little half hoop, which we see repeated a few times. So what I'll do is select it, and then I'm going to Alt drag it over here, and you see that made a duplicate. And I'm just pulling that over to the side. We also have this circle that is repeated throughout the typeface, so I'll Alt drag that over as well, just like that. We've got these two types of lines, the up line, Alt drag that over, and the side line. And we've got this X as well. So we've got these, and we want to make sure that the X's are grouped within our letters. So I'll select that and hit Control-G because we want that just to be one layer within our letters. However, over here, I'm going to have this be two pieces. So I'll grab that group and hit Control-Shift-G to ungroup it over here on the side. So you can see I've got this stroke and that stroke separate. Okay, so you'll want to go through and any place you see an X in your letters, select those and group them. There aren't a ton of them, but there's enough that you will save yourself some time by doing that. Now this one's a little bit more difficult, so I'll have to grab the whole thing, then shift select the outside part. So I've only got the X on the inside, and I'll hit Control-G to group that. Same thing over here on the T. I'll select that whole bit and then just hold Shift and select back over the part that I don't want. And that looks like that's all the X's. Okay, so we've got all of our X's grouped in our letters, and then we've got this one separated, and now I want to make artboards for these little pieces as well. So I'll just grab my artboard tool again, and left click, going down through those shapes, creating their artboards. Now some of these you might want to make their artboards a little bit bigger than the actual size. You could redo this in After Effects if you wanted to, but it might be easier just to do here. So on this one, I'll do 20 for that size, and it's a little bit close to that one, so I'm just left clicking and dragging to move it down. Those are fine. I don't mind them being the size of the artboard. This one, let's do 20 on that one as well, and then this one we'll do 20 here also, and I'm just going to move that up. Perfect. Okay, so now we've got all of these artboards with their little shapes, and that's going to come into play later on. So now that we've duplicated those pieces, created artboards for them, deleted our main artboard, we're going to move on to our next lesson where I'm going to show you how to use a script to separate these paths into different layers. And we'll talk about why that's important in our next lesson.